Awesome. Thanks everyone for joining us. This is our first Culture Mercado Cultures of World Building event. This is going to be part of a upcoming series of discussions with game designers that are involved in making diverse games, games that integrate culture, faith, other parts of diverse experiences and identities. And we're very fortunate to be joined today by Sharang Biswas and Jeeyon Shim, who are going to be speaking with us. Jeeon's camera is not working today, but that's not a problem. We get to have a great conversation. And throughout the conversation, if anyone has any questions, please ask them. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers, or actually let our speakers introduce themselves. So we'll start with Sharang. Go ahead and give us a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah, so I'm Sharang Biswas. I use he pronouns for myself. I'm a game designer, writer, interactive artist, and professor of games. Um, what else about me is important? I am not foreign anymore. I used to always say I am foreign, but as of 2 months ago, I am not. Um, I think cold chocolate milk is the zenith of the Anthropocene, and no other human innovation can top its lacto cacao goodness. Um, I recently, as of like 2 years ago, started considering myself more of an athlete than I ever did in my life because I joined a gay triathlon club in New York. Um, and last year, I started getting really, really involved in the local bondage scene. So that also has become important to me recently. Um, yeah, my teaching is mainly at NYU and Fordham, though I've also taught at Dartmouth, Bard, and the New School. Um, yeah, that's me. And I met Aaron through gaming things because Aaron is cool.
All right, Sharang, thank you. And Jeeyon, I'd love to hear more about what you're doing and working on. And thank you again for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. For everyone joining us, hi, I'm Jeeyon. It's really nice to meet you. I'm a writer, game designer, and publisher, multimedia artist, and a former outdoor educator based in California. Um, uh, I've won an Indiecade for Best Live Action Game and a Diana Jones Emerging Designer Award for my work. And been featured on Slate, The Verge, and Polygon. Most importantly, some of the kids I used to teach got in touch with me recently and said they think I'm cool, which I think transcends any future award I might ever be given.
Hey, Gian, are you not going to say you were featured in Broken Pencil magazine in an interview
I
written by a friend
was
of yours?
featured. That's right. I was featured in I was the cover story in Broken Pencil magazine.
Yeah.
That's yes, that's the feather in my cap. Thank
The
you,
editor,
Sharang.
the editor was like, Sharang, there's a cool designer named Jeeyon. Would you like to interview her? And I'm like, you know that I'm friends with her, right? They're like, wait, what? And I'm like, yes. I thought that's why you reached out to me.
Incredible. Um, just as a very brief summary, I think I was trying to think about how to structure this bio. I think relevantly to this discussion, one of my underlying creative through lines that's shown up consistently in my entire body of work is a focus on the challenge of designing games as a medium for transformative connections between players and the world. Um, for a while, the tagline for my publishing company used to be games that face the world. It's a little too abstract, so I've had to change it, but that really is the ethos of things that I do. And in terms of things that I just enjoy as a person, love mushroom foraging, one of my favorite things to do. I love camping, making things with my hands in general. Love that. Whatever lets me dig around in the dirt or carve a stick or whatever. I love all of that stuff. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much. And as we kind of transition to get into things, let's go ahead and just kind of dive right in. The first question I have is for both of you, and I just wanted to know, why do you think building culture into gameplay is important for the overall gaming experience, and how do you think that building diverse worlds helps to motivate people in just the way they think and approach gameplay?
Mm. Do you want to start, Sharon?
Sure. So multiple reasons, obviously, right? And that's a whole thing. I think first off, the simplest reason is fictional worlds are going to be both more interesting and more impactful to people experiencing them if they have a sense of culture to them, right? So if it's a realist piece of work, then you can build in like some real world cultures, and that is easy. That's simpler because you can draw on real world stuff. But if you're doing speculative work, um, a world that features interesting world building with different cultures interacting is going to feel richer and more alive, and is going to be a better world to experience. But also, we learn and form a picture of the world, the real world around us, partially through the media we all consume, right? And this is true for everyone, right? And I don't just mean media as in TV and video games, all kinds of media, right? Newspaper, if people still read physical newspaper, some people do, right? And
Surely,
so,
surely they
um,
must.
and so, having representations of diverse human experiences helps people like learn about these diverse experiences, not necessarily learn in that, oh, now I know what the feast days of this religion are, but just learn the fact that the human difference exists, and the fact that people can behave in different ways and behave and do different things and believe different things, right? Antonio Gramsci talks about this idea that if you like hegemonies maintain power by defining what is considered common sense, right? And what is considered the norm. And much of what we learn of as the norm, much of what we learn of as common sense comes from this media consumption that we have, the diet of messages that come to us from other people. And so if the diet that's coming to us is very monocultural, then we will only think that is the norm and that is what should be. And if the diet we're given is diverse and exciting and shows the ways that all the people on this planet behave, especially given that much of the media that people consume come from a very select language center and center of culture compared to the population on the planet, right? Like the biggest population on the planet are India and China, and yet the most popular media is in English and comes from the US and the UK most likely, right? And so having representations of diverse cultures and things is critical to create like global citizens, for people who are aware of humanity in all its richness and all its beauty and ugliness, but in all its like myriad forms, right? So, yeah.
Well, I really appreciate that. And yeah, let's take it to you, Jeeyon.
Yeah, I mean, how to follow up such a thoughtful and thorough and well-cited answer. I think in order to not retread ground that Sharang's already said that I have in my bullet points as well, in a more practical, like material context, like at the table, as it were, creating culture or a game that has very well designed and integrated culture aids in setting expectations from a facilitation point of view, but both diegetically and as like a group facilitator or participant in like a group recreational and social activity. Culture creation and setting was a huge part of my program design when I worked as the coordinator and program designer for a live action role playing camp that had the mission statement of teaching kids to be more ecologically aware and responsible and engaged, but through, you know, storytelling and fantasy. And it also was like a summer camp for kids, which means safety and culture setting, all of those things are tantamount. And so a lot of the ground work of having a successful program was making sure that that culture setting was done early and often and then reinforced throughout. I think, you know, culture in game can manifest in so many ways, but it is integrated into the culture of your group, the culture of wherever your players come from, cultures that they might find themselves in dissonance with, which can also crop up in the game, right? All of these things have hard to quantify integrations with each other. And so being able to say, like, at this table, you know, this is what we're doing. In this world, this is what it looks like, at least gives you all a common vocabulary from which to approach from different backgrounds and points of view. Um, I think it's also it provides the life layer for the play experience. Are you familiar with the term life layer?
No.
Oh, it's very cool. I heard about it on a podcast. It's the part of sets and props in film productions, whether on TV or movies, uh, of things actors interact physically with that are as realistic as possible. So, for example, um, the woman who they interviewed, who's just this incredible, she's just incredible at her job, said there was a movie that she worked on with some big name actors who can absolutely carry their own weight, set in the 80s, in which one of the characters has to go through like boxes and like a wall of boxes of invoices from 1980s, right? And she hunted down the paper, found real invoices, made invoices that were like directly related to the story and the characters of that movie. And, you know, she says that might seem like an excessive amount of detail, but the actor's job is to act, and my job is to give them the best tools to be able to do so. If you, a huge pet peeve of mine personally is like when you see something and the actors have like a coffee cup in their hand and it's clear that it's empty, right? If you actually put hot coffee in there, they will interact with it the way that they normally interact with hot coffee. If you make sure that culture is integrated in the foundation of your game and the way that it manifests is like a consistent question that you're always like engaging with and answering, your players will just play better. You know, they will have a richer, more memorable experience. And those moments, those like transformative connecting moments that I think this kind of game really encourages can happen more fluidly and easily.
I think the coffee cup example is really powerful because, I mean, playing, okay, so Jeeyon and my specialty for both of us is analog role-playing games, right? That's what both of us focus on. And playing an analog role-playing game is actually a very challenging task, right? Because you as a player and GM, all the players, including game masters, are building story as they play, and you're sometimes building worlds as you play. And if you have an idea of the culture of the world you're in, that gives you social in-game, in-world social rules with which to orient your character and their behaviors, right? So if you know that you're in a world where, like we know many of this, right? Like if you play a old school style medieval fantasy game, you know that you can't just be like, if the king is addressing you, you can't just snap at the king, right? Like that's not something that is done in that culture, which allows for powerful role play because you know that, oh, if you're being talked to by the king, this is a big honor or whatever, and
Yeah.
I'm just like yell at them, right? And if it's an alien made up world, then having other cultural cues like, oh, you know that when addressing the tree of growth and eternity, that you mustn't look them in the face because that is disrespectful. That
Yeah.
allows you to do rich character play, right, Gia?
Yeah, absolutely. If I can, I know we have other questions to get to, but this just triggered a thing that I'd love to share. Right now, I'm playtesting with my weekly home game group, a game that I'm working on that takes place with mech pilots, but rather than setting them in space, they're in the deep sea. So I did a lot of research on like deep saturation divers and things like that.
Yeah.
And we decided for our campaign that it was going to be part of a program, an extension of like a near future pre-apocalyptic American military program, which means like there are lots of like expectations in how the characters interact with each other, but I deliberately wrote things in to drive like the drama. This is a system that is loosely based on Monster Hearts. So for example, you cannot have mixed rank fraternization, which I don't think is really a rule in the American military, but I said it specifically here because that means for a little while, if someone wants to have their character romantically connect with another one, it has to be clandestine. They have to hide, they have to find and sneak around. You know, there's things like that that you can imply very heavily.
Yeah.
And then
And that
also,
creates rich gameplay opportunities
yes,
for
yes.
players,
And
right?
also because our game group is all not cis men, basically, I in order to not create real life dissonance and discomfort, I said like this program is for the American military complex, pretty not just tolerant, but very accepting of people with non-binary gender, queer identity, and all that. But it's because they know that they have lifers in there. They have mech pilots who will potentially literally do this program until they die because it's a vulnerable population made up of people who probably are quite traumatized and may or may not have strong community backgrounds in their own geographic location. And so you can there's no subversion without a foundation, right? Like without that expectation, You can't go around it. You can't poison it, but in a positive valence, right? Like in a way where you want to narratively poison it so that your players can kind of like use themselves as foil against it. And I think, it also, like, there is no way you don't take that critically out into the world with you, right? And I think it would be wonderful to encourage any kind of exercise of critical analysis that we can in today's present and the future.
Definitely. I mean, I really enjoy everything you both have said so far. I mean, it reminds me, there's a writer who recently passed, Dubravko Gresic, who wrote a book called Karaoke Culture. And part of the book, which is a series of essays, explores the fact that a lot of times new cultural creation comes from when you kind of smash cultures together, when they come together.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the things that I like just in hearing about the game that you're playtesting, is that you're kind of taking these cultures, putting a little bit of them together to create something new and something that's beautiful. And I
Well,
think that,
thank you.
yeah. And, I think that kind of leads into this next question, since you've already kind of addressed it a little bit, which is that, do you think it's possible to write parts of your identity into a game without alienating or excluding other players?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think you can even do so while explicitly, again, expectation setting, right? While explicitly saying in the text, there are some parts of this game that you not only would be stretching yourself to touch, but like cannot touch, right? I think Coyote and Crow is an excellent example of this, right? For people who don't know, Coyote and Crow is a game that is very forward-facingly designed by an entirely Indigenous American creative team and produced, I believe, by an entirely Indigenous production team as well. And it takes place in a future kind of like sci-fi-ish world with fantasy elements, in a speculative history, with like a speculative history in the past of that world building where colonization did not happen in America. And as a result, Indigenous identity and markers are, first of all, like not hegemonized, not turned into a single monolith to generalize from. Like there's a lot of specificity in the text. And also the text will say occasionally, like, this is a concept that basically, unless you're Indigenous, it is extremely difficult to understand. And we as the designers are not saying you can't try, but, it is difficult to do this in a way that does not offend, more or less. And I think like that is kind of a caution tape situation, right? And yet it is a very popular system. It sells very well. It does very well in actual plays. So clearly there isn't like broad audience alienation happening there.
Yeah.
I'm going to go the opposite direction and
Oh.
say that Jeeyon and I have been friends for many years.
Yeah.
And say that first, it is impossible to make a game without putting elements of your background and culture into it. It's impossible to make a work of art without that, right? Because even if, let's say, Aaron, in the boundless wealth that he has, with which he can hire me with, commissions a $2 million game from me and says, Sharang, I want you to make a game about Yiddish poets, right? Because that's something that Aaron works with a lot. That is not a culture that I'm part of. But if I were to make this game with a team of, Yiddish knowledgeable people, even if I were making that game with this team, I am imposing my cultural viewpoint of what that culture is, right, onto the game, right? So it is impossible to make any kind of artwork without putting in a little bit of your
Yeah.
culture. It is also, I think, impossible to make a bit of artwork that someone in the world does not despise, right? Because every piece of art that you put out in the world, someone will love it
Oh.
for reasons that you never considered in your life, right? Someone will be like, wow, this game speaks to me about, like, my game Feast, in when it won its first award,
Incredible.
the first judge, thanks, John. The first judge who awarded it, her judge's statement was like, "This is a game about colonialism." I'm like, "What?" I had no idea that someone could take that reading from that game, right? So she liked it for that reason, but I'm sure there are other people who look at it and they hate it for a reason I have never planned, right? And that is because they usually, because their culture clashes with my cultural standing in some way. And this is very apparent when for the last 4 years, I think, Eurogamer has asked me to write one of their Summer Pride series articles, right? And every single year, at least one of the comments says, why is this author using the word queer so freely? This is a slur.
Oh, yes, that's
right?
yeah,
All the time. And the thing is,
come up online a
yeah,
lot
and
with younger
Eurogamer is a
people.
British magazine, which means it
Yeah.
is not from a culture I'm not very part of or familiar with, even though my education is in British spelling. Um, and so every year, and I'm not going to say you're terrible because they have a lived experience in which maybe they were on the receiving end of that as a slur, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I can't be like, no, you're wrong. I can just be like, well, I think you are not paying attention to the last few decades of discourse on queer theory. But that
And
doesn't mean
also
they're wrong.
queer history in general, right? Like there's an
Right. But again,
ahistoricism to that.
if they have a lived experience, even
Exactly.
like just the title of some of these pieces can be alienating for them, right? So I think in some sense, it is impossible to make a piece of art where there's not going to be cultural clash for someone. And that is a possibly an ugly reality, but also possibly a beautiful reality,
I
because
mean,
that
I think
kind of,
it's the reality of making art, right?
yeah,
Like,
and I say the word beautiful because that just shows there is human difference exists, and that it is not necessary. There's very rarely is there a cut and dry like right and wrong. Right? I cannot tell
yes.
someone, no, you should be okay with the word queer being used because everyone else is using it well. If they're like, no, but I have a traumatic experience from it, it will never be okay
Right.
for me, right?
There's also,
So
just on a personal level, there's a lot of power to being like, oh, well, I don't know what this person has been through. I don't know what's bringing them to this point in time engaging with me, but I don't have to engage with them. I can walk away. Like we
yeah,
can
which is what I do on the
understand that
internet.
there
I'm
are
like, I'm
differences.
not gonna
Yeah.
comment.
Yeah.
No, I wrote my
Yeah.
article. You read my piece. Done.
Yeah. You didn't like it? Great. I don't have to look at why you didn't like it. Like it's that's art as well, right? Like I
Yeah.
think people have heightened reactions to art in general for
Which is the
many
point of
many
art.
many
Which is the point of
reasons,
art.
which is the point of art, right? But the way that it comes up in games, and particularly our little pie slice of games, is that for a long time games were very closely associated with identity and culture in a kind of like checkbox, like check off the box kind of way. Like I don't know how else to explain it, but sometimes people would introduce a game title to me and be like, it's about queer found family, and all of the character sheets are characters of color, and like go down a list of like very appealing narrative things, but it seemed like they were checking off menu items on one of those build your own burger chains. And it was like a little jarring for me, right? Because I like art because it's complicated and messy and nuanced, and because of that your relation to it changes over time. um
And this is
and
true of very lauded games as well, right,
mhm,
Jeeyon? Like, I'm thinking
yeah,
of Bluebeard's Bride, right? I was on the
yeah,
Indies, I think that year of Indiecade when Bluebeard's Bride won. Bluebeard's Bride won tons of awards. But Bluebeard's Bride,
yeah,
at its heart, is a game about intimate partner violence against women, right? That
yeah.
is the theme of the game. And that is not a game for everyone. Not everyone wants to play a game like that, even if I think it's a brilliant game. But I've written articles about it. I
I
pitched
think it's
talks about it.
beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah. And also you can run the game in different ways. When I ran the game with strangers, I do not bring in overt elements of sexual assault ever, right?
Right.
If I run the game with people I know, I may be like, hey, this is a game that this theme might come up. Are we okay with it? People like, sure. And I ran the game once for a guy I was dating, his wife, and some undergrad friends of mine. So these were all people I was very close to. And for the first time ever in my gaming GMing experience ever, I ran a scene where there was an on-screen sexual assault going on, right?
Wow.
And a lot of people are like, "Oh, this should never be in a game." I disagree heavily. I think any
I
art,
disagree. I
yeah,
disagree with that.
any
Yeah.
art can talk about any topic as long as you're doing it in a respectful way
Yeah.
where everyone knows what's going on and stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
And that group responded very well to it, right? And we talked at the end of the game. There's always a debrief. We talked about what the game felt like, what it meant, what it did, right? But that's the only time I've ever done that, because that is, that's a cultural thing. Which in this case it was a micro culture, right? With my close, right?
Yeah.
So
I mean, there's so many, again, it's very hard to excise the like youth programming facilitator design out of me. Like from a facilitation point of view, you have to set so many expectations and you're dealing with so many variables when you introduce very charged topics. But I think it's important that charged topics stay in art. And I think it's important that things that are unpleasant or uncomfortable, even, upsetting, remain in art, because again, like that is one of the functions of art. Art's function and purpose is to exist as art. So like even if you had a game that had sexual violence in it and was not thoughtful about it, which there are definitely analog tabletop games that exist out there that are not thoughtful about it, those games still have a right to exist and people still have a right to like them. Like that
and
is
to
something that
dislike
is
them.
intrinsic, and to dislike them. Exactly. Yeah.
I think
You
that
know, it's like that unfortunate situation, right, where you find yourself defending something like some schlocky horror movie in a dinner table conversation because you're like, I can't believe I'm gonna die on this hill for whatever, like Cannibal Vixens 4, but here I am defending its right to exist as art, right?
I love that.
I just made that up, but maybe that exists in real life. Who knows? More power to you if it does.
Yeah, I think that that's a great example. And I think this kind of leads into this really interesting point about looking at art. And the idea is that, is there a kind of genre within games that's more conducive to incorporating personal identity or something that does create more natural latching points for people? I know we talked a little bit about both of your games before this event started. And I know that your games kind of do create these natural opportunities for people to gravitate to culture. So again, just kind of curious to hear more about if you think there are certain genres of games that are more conducive to personal
I mean,
identity.
I think I tell my students that it is valuable to draw on personal experience when making any kind of creative work. And this is true for any kind of creative work, right? So like,
Yeah.
I found that I joke with my ex-husband about this because after our divorce, I have written and sold, I think, 7, 8 short stories or poems that are directly about my divorce, right? They're directly about my breakup. Right? And my ex-husband was like, "You're welcome, Sharang." And I'm like, but right, and I only write speculative fiction for the most. No, sorry, I also write a lot of nonfiction, as the article says. But in my fiction realm, I tend to write speculative fiction, right? And one of my friends, Evgenia Triantafilou, she's a Greek science fiction fantasy writer. She told me once that she's like, "Oh, Sharon, I think one of your strengths is you're good at bringing your real world experience into your speculative fiction, right? And in small, weird little ways, right? And I think drawing on personal experience makes art more specific.
Yes.
And it's not just this general thing of like, that's a song about love. What does that mean? No, this is a song about the love I had for, I don't know, my childhood friend who then left because he thought I was too religious and didn't want to be my friend anymore, right? Like those kinds of specificities, one, make the artwork better because you can draw on that in a more specific way and you can write more detail and things like that. By write, I mean include. I can write, can paint. But also it allows for people experiencing the work. I don't want to use the word consume because it feels very like
I know it feels icky. I don't like
right,
it.
right. It feels like content creator. Ugh.
Yeah.
I'm like, no, you're a porn star. You can say you're a porn star. You don't have to be a content creator. That's fine. Right. But it allows audiences to glimpse into like these realities that are not theirs and are actual realities, even if they're couched in speculative like aliens and zombies and things like that, right? And so I think drawing on personal experience is useful for any genre of work because you're always going to draw on your perspective, as we said earlier, right? Your perspective is always going to be there. But drawing on your own experience, however abstracted it becomes in the final work, Like what I wrote, one of my early stories that I published in Lightspeed magazine was about skinning your dead partner and turning his skin into a book. Aaron, you read it even, right? Um, that obviously is not just about skinning your partner and turning it into a book.
Yeah.
There are like other things going on. It's formed by my experience. And of course, one of the reviews for it was like, this is not speculative fiction enough. I'm like, wow, this might be informed on your real world experience in a very
It's
convincing
sure
way.
not mine.
But like that was drawing on my real like emotional truths and things like that, right? So I think
Hmm.
all art has the potential to be enriched through through the drawing of the artist's personal experience.
Absolutely. Like when you're making art, I think your first and best tool is personal observation, right? Like not like from a non-judgmental place, just pure observation. And then your second best tool is like good research. I have a friend who is a lapsed Catholic and also a huge fan of vampires and somehow had not watched Midnight Mass. And I was like, we have to watch it now. And there is a moment that made me realize like, oh my God, I thought I was frittering away so many hours doing research, but actually I need to fritter away way more. That he was like, over text because we were watching but not on voice, he was like, oh my God, he's wearing the gold chasuble, which when I watched Midnight Mass and one of the characters gets on a new priest case for wearing the gold chasuble when it wasn't the right day, I thought she was just being nitpicky. And my friend explained, no, no, no. If you're a Catholic, you only wear that on Christmas or Easter, which are like the big time days. And so immediately he twigged onto something being off, right? About this character, about what was going to happen to this town. And I had no idea, right? And it's really cool how much can be left unsaid and yet communicated. And I think the way that you learn the tools to write well through implications like that is to, build a world that you might not fully use and to just remain curious about things, and to try to bring that curiosity to your own world building, your own design, your own play. Um, I've recently been reading a lot of fiction from the point of view of unreliable narrators who, among other reasons, are unreliable because they're just not interested in that many things, and so they'll like gloss over something that sounds like fascinating, right? And then you don't hear or see any of it. I'm thinking about
So that you know what that makes me think of? That makes me think of the movie Y Tu Mama Tambien.
yeah, yeah,
They're just being road tripping and having sex with each other while all this political stuff is just happens in the background around them.
yeah,
And you're like, yeah, these kids like don't care about all this happening. They're just like trying to bang each other. It was wild.
yeah.
Yeah.
There's a great and very like digestible, I guess, which I guess sounds like consume actually. It's like a quick read and it stays with you. There's a series of novellas called The Murderbot Diaries by Martha
Oh yeah, yeah,
Wells.
yeah. Very famous.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's really good. They're really good and they're very engaging. And this is one of those examples, right, of a character who is extremely well versed in like one and a half things and has zero interest in anything else. And so in this series that hinges on questions of personal autonomy and how do you remain autonomous in a system that is like extremely difficult to retain any kind of autonomy in or agency in. At one point, it uses like no gender pronouns, mentions the existence of what are called comfort units, but are definitely sex bots. Everyone knows they're sex bots. Like that's what they're for. That's what they're made for. And it's like, I mean, if you're going to talk about personal agency and autonomy, but because that character has zero interest in sexual attraction or dynamics, you don't see any of it. And also, the human crew that Murderbot travels with is clearly going through some intense polycule romantic drama. And again, you only see snatches of it because Murderbot tries to leave the second it realizes that's the conversation that's happening around it. And so it's like, you know, being able to write like that and create like that and also play like that, right? Knowing just enough of what to show and leaving the rest unseen is a really, really handy skill, I think, for any creative work.
Yeah.
It's like, oh my God, do you know that Roland Barthes quote about like the true nature of the erotic, I think?
No.
Oh, I mean, I'm gonna butcher this, but it's something to the effect of like is not the most erotic part of a body the glimpse of a wrist you catch between the coat cuff and the glove, or the ankle right above the sock, or the back of their neck above their collar. Like it's the glimpse of what you
Oh,
see.
here. Is
Yeah.
not the most erotic portion of a body where the garment gapes?
Yes, 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 yeah. And I love that. I love that.
That's a great quote,
I
actually. Wow.
it's dude, I'm not gonna lie, I did not understand 85% of the Roland Barthes that I've read, but the 15% I have, love it. Love him. And that the pleasure of the text is one of the readings that I remember actually like retaining a lot from and influencing me a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No.
he continues. I'm gonna cut out bits. It is there are no erogenous zones. It is intermittence which is erotic. The intermittence of skin flashing between two articles of clothing, between two edges. It is this flash itself which seduces, or rather the staging of an appearance as disappearance.
Yeah. This reminds me of a conversation I had with a friend of I have several friends who are sex workers, and a few of them have been sex workers for like multiple decades. And there was someone else at the table with us who was not quite as familiar with just like the day-to-day realities of like what working as a sex worker is like. And he asked like some boneheaded, I mean, like he was a fine person, but it was like, have you ever had clients who are like bad in bed? And she actually like took it, to her credit and his credit, like she took him on face value and answered it seriously. And her answer was like, I actually think being bad in bed is a myth. I think like sure, there are certain things that some people might like in a more broadly applicable sense, but ultimately a good experience in bed is about the connection you have with the people you're there with. And my job is to form a genuine, authentic connection with my clients. And I thought that that was, again, like very thoughtful and like kind of affirming in a way, because I think it's true, right? Like people will remember fondly encounters from like very, very early on in their romantic and sexual lives where they might not have shall we say, applied field experience, but like clearly really liked that person and remembers that encounter with the valence of what they like about them. And that's what retains it in that like haze of erotic and romantic in their mind. And I think like, you know, it's so easy to get into restrictive, binary should or should not language when it comes to creative work and creative play, but that doesn't exist, right? Like,
Yeah, this is I had this experience when I was in a panel. I was in a panel at PAX Unplugged, and it was about queer world building. And Aaron, you might have even been there at the panel, like attending,
I was.
because we were at a number of, yeah, we've done lots of things together. Um, and I was there, and I was one of the older people on the panel. Older, I was like 27 at that time, or 26 or something.
God.
But there were a lot of like younger designers there. By young, I mean like 21, 22, 23. And someone asked a question about like trans representation in games.
Mm.
And this really speaks to this, the rule that you said, Jeeyon, which is like there are very few should and should not, especially when it comes to making art. And they're like, well, how do we do trans representation well in games? And one person was like, you should never dead name someone in a work in fiction. Like that's really bad. And I'm like, talk about speculative fiction here,
Yeah.
right? Like in our current, and I may say very current Western culture, the idea of dead naming is distasteful. And even then, there's nuance, right? Like I was
Yeah.
talking to Avery Alder once, and I'm like, "Oh, Avery, I wrote an article about you way back when, where I quoted you, but I used your dead name because I quoted you from an article in which they
Hmm.
interviewed you before you transitioned." And Avery was like, that was a part of my life. It happened. It existed.
Yeah.
I'm not right.
Yeah.
Not that I dead named her, but like she wasn't like, oh, you know.
Yeah.
So different like viewpoints. And the same thing in this question of like in this fictional world today, I'm like, well, what if I'm building a culture where people collect names throughout their life and string them all together, and then you also change gender, maybe, right? So like
Yeah.
in art, there are very few rules, and we'll, as we grow older, we see more and more of the rules that we follow are culturally dependent,
Yeah.
and we can ask why, right? Like
Yeah.
right now, we're in this cultural moment, at least in New York, where people are asking why monogamy, right? That's becoming more and
Yeah,
more a thing
yeah.
now, which many
Oh,
of
I
us
saw
in the
that
queer world,
hilarious New York Times
yeah,
piece.
yeah,
Yeah.
which many of us in the queer world especially have been asking
God,
for ever, right?
that
Um,
piece was like dating in my 20s, and I did not like that time capsule at all. You know, it's like, how dare
yeah, it
you
was
remind me
very funny,
of
especially
this?
because like people always make it sound like, for example, I have never been monogamous in my life, right? Because
Mhm.
when I started dating, which is when I was 17 in college, freshman year of university, I went to a conference in Vermont where the first talk I saw was Tristan Taormino talking about polyamory, right? And so my entire dating cultural life has been about polyamory, right? So like uh, cultural things are fluid, and they're, like Jeeyon said, when you're making art, there's rarely a like hard and fast
Yeah.
rule.
Yeah.
Um, even things like, yeah, like something that we would not do, like don't dead name someone that's distasteful. Well, in a fictional world, it
You
might
can't
not.
apply, yeah, you can't, once art starts getting used as a vector for a morality tale, like, you've lost, you know?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's very
And
true.
I hate this current thing of like this story is problematic because the characters do bad things. Like maybe that's what the art's about, right? Like
That
about the
reminds me
Yeah.
of
characters being.
that reminds me of being in college. Our t-shirts for the politics department where I find blank problematic. And unfortunately, when you expand that to all of existence, then things don't exist in the same way. They're not as fun. If it's cool, I'm gonna ask one last question and then open it up for our audience. But one of the
Yeah.
questions, actually, I think this goes really beautifully to something you said, Jeeyon, which is about your friend, about the fact that it's about our experience and our connection to the client. And so I'm kind of curious if either of you could share, or if both of you could share about just some words of wisdom or advice for young game designers. Uh, what is your consideration in your game design and your clients? Do you have like an ideal uh, kind of person or community in mind when you make games?
So is the
Me.
question like, what advice would we give to young designers, or like
It's
observations about our
it's
own work, or?
It's both. It's basically like, when you're creating, who are you creating for? Are you creating for yourself as a means of creation, or are you
Mm,
for a community? And I feel like that's something a lot of game designers, that I've met or spoken to, especially in kind of promoting this event. It's been really interesting. People keep coming and saying, "Oh, well, I'm doing this event or I'm doing this game." And everyone else is like, "Well, who cares about that game?" Or somebody is like, "Oh,
right.
I really want to reach this audience." And then people will give them
Oh,
feedback.
I see.
They might reach that.
Yeah. Yeah, like, setting aside, and it's a huge aside, the practical considerations of marketing and like needing to support yourself as an artist, like, in that sense, like, I want to reach this audience means something very different than like pure creative drive. But just focusing on the pure creative drive, I absolutely write and design, for myself. I write and design things that I would find interesting to play, and I think that's what most artists do, because writing, like just writing, right, is a physically taxing, cognitively grueling activity. If you weren't doing it because you really liked and enjoyed some aspect of what you're writing about, it's awful. But also because that will encourage you and remind you over time to create for your best readers, your best players, not the person you're afraid of yelling about you online, like the person who you are so excited that they played your game. And that doesn't necessarily mean that's your target audience, right? Like, a lot of my solo game, God, during Field Guide to Memory and The Shape of Shadows, I got so many emails from people saying that their children had joined in to the journaling with them and like co-created characters. And my target audience is definitely not children. I am not a children or YA author or designer, but like, that delighted me because I love teaching kids. I was a youth educator for several years, and like, the fact that my games can still do that, like, really like lit the fire in my hearth and like kept me warm for a long time. But also because it will like give you the power to just walk away from things that are wastes of your time as well, right? Like, why write for the curmudgeon when you could write for someone who's curious about the world and curious about the world you're building, right? Write for those people uh who excite you.
Yeah. And I feel
Yeah,
like
I'm gonna give a I'm gonna give a lofty answer, then I'm gonna give a pragmatic answer, then hopefully people can meet in the middle, right? In the lofty answer, like think about impressionism, right? When Monet painted Impression Soleil Levant, he was like, I'm gonna do whatever the fuck I want in plein air, and it's gonna be amazing. And people were like, oh, this isn't even a painting. This is an impression. It's an impression, right? What rubbish is this? And then he is one of the most famous painters ever, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Because he just did whatever he wanted, right? So at some level, like harkening back to our first question, someone on the planet will like your work. It just happened to be with Monet. It was many people on the planet liked his work, right? So yeah, at the lofty level, like do whatever you want. Like I'm writing a story right now that I'm submitting to a magazine soon, which is about people who go to a kink convention and murder each other in the most brutal way possible.
Oh yeah,
So
you
for
had
sexual pleasure. I told you about this, Aaron, right?
yeah.
I might
You
even read
make
a
saucy
bit of it.
games. You get those saucy games heard.
What
And
was
you,
that? What was that?
I said you make saucy games and you
I
write
do make
saucy
saucy games.
stories, even
I
if
They're
do write some
very,
saucy
they're
stuff.
stories
spicy
are
sauces too.
But
Yeah.
it's a very like gory story
Hmm.
with a lot of like I am deriving sexual pleasure from hacking off your limbs, right? And then they use necromancy to bring it back to life. And that's like a particular style. Not everyone wants to
Yeah.
read that, right? Like some people might love it, some might hate it, right? But I want to write it because it speaks to my experience, not of hacking people's limbs off, but you know, in a different way. Um,
Yeah. I mean,
and
that's
so that's a
horror,
lot.
right?
Yeah, and that's the lofty answer. The pragmatic answer is, of course, like what do you achieve? What are you hoping to achieve with your work, right? Um, I love that McGay Baker, one of the co-creators of Apocalypse World,
Brilliant
um,
designer. Brilliant.
right?
She and Vincent
She
both. Yeah.
in her like talk, she always says, "Don't quit your day job in order to make tabletop role-playing games because you will starve." Right?
Yeah.
Jeeyon and I are fortunate in that various circumstances around us have allowed us to be successful. It doesn't mean we are better game designers than anyone else. It just means we have maybe made
It's
use of
luck.
the circumstances we find
Yeah.
ourselves exactly, right? Um, and the networks we've cultivated, right? So the pragmatic answer is sometimes you do have to think about your audience. If Aaron has commissioned you to write Yiddish poetry themed game, think
okay.
about who your audience is going to be, and don't write things that will make that audience angry because Aaron will be like, "What the hell did you make me? I can't sell this to my audience, right? Or I can't put this in the magazine and stuff, right?" So the pragmatic answer is know the purpose of what you're making. Because if the purpose of what you're making is to self-expression, is to like make something, put it out there, it doesn't matter who buys it, who, whatever, you should write whatever you want because who knows what will resonate with people, right? If all we wrote was safe things, and again, by wrote, it could be paint, it could be compose. If all we did was safe things, then we'd never have innovation, right?
Yeah.
But again, realistically, if you're a budding game designer and you want to make work that appeals, like if you, let's say you want to submit to festival, like, okay, well, what kind of work do festival people like? Just like if you're a filmmaker, you know that certain kinds of movies win Oscars and certain kinds don't, right? So hopefully a designer can meet in the middle. Just like everything else, there's always nuance, right? Yes, be like pie in the sky and make your gruesome art about, you know, like make the Antichrist, right? Where you masturbate someone with their own blood or whatever. But also, what if you want to sell, if that's your goal, then think about the audience. And hopefully you'll be able to meet in the middle where it'll come from both sides. Like you'll be catering to your audience, but also including things that you actually want to I'm going to start not saying right, I'm going to say paint now, paint about. Because again, it's applicable to every kind of art, right? So
Yeah. No, thank you both. And I just wanted to take a moment to see if anyone who's watching in wants to ask any questions. You can do so in the chat. You can also come off mute if you have a question. And if not, we can just keep talking for a moment. I know it's something that we're all good at. Uh, and
yeah,
yeah,
actually though.
yeah, so I guess great. Well, while we're continuing on with this, I think one of the next things is just hearing more about what you're working on and what you think is interesting that you're either working on or a game that you played recently, anything that you kind of want to share as we wrap up.
Ooh, the non-glamorous part of this answer is right now I'm playing catch up on a lot of projects that I meant to fulfill in 2022 and 2023 and couldn't because I got long COVID. But the silver lining of that is I don't know how many people have experienced this about writing, but you know that thing where you're writing, you're like, I hate this. I'm a hack. I don't know how this has ever worked. And then you leave it alone for a year and you come back, you're like, oh, I'm pretty good, actually. Like that's happening with these games. And it's a delightful experience to like kind of rediscover myself, you know, in that way. But I'm also simultaneously, right, because it would be hugely impractical to only be playing catch up. I'm working on games that I want to release in the future. I have a meeting with a very cool horror artist where we're talking about something kind of like low key interactive, like the daily email games that I've done in the past. Um, I am working on the Leviathan is the name of that deep sea mech pilot game. You know, just kind of like percolating it as I go. And then there's uh a game I've been working on for years called The Luminous Door. And this is like the game that I baby and like don't want to show people because it's so precious to me. But I've been working on that a lot. It's a portal fantasy game about a group of adults who basically went through an entire lifetime, like the four children in Narnia.
The Pevensies,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, became kings and queens, and then for some reason the world spat them back out as children again in our
That
world,
would
and
be
they had to,
awful.
yeah, they had to live their life over again, and now they're all together, and the door opens for them again because they're needed, and so they have to go back, right? You know, it's flouting that you can't step in the same river twice, I guess. But yeah, it's a concept that is like very precious to me, but also it's a game that very directly engages with non-human community and a love of nature and like the grief that goes into living in a climate and an era where, you know, that's a very precarious love, but also like intrinsic to being human, I think. All of the worlds are modeled after the different biomes on Earth, and all of the world building has a lot to do with like human and non-human communities. So I've really been enjoying working on that a lot.
Yeah, that's amazing. And one day I hope you are ready to share it with everybody because that sounds incredible. And Sharang, what are you working on? And then we do have a question that came in that
Oh
looks,
yeah, it's a good question too.
yeah,
Yeah. What am I working on? I'm on a couple of things. The big ones, I have a book coming out next year from Neon Hemlock Press. It's called The Iron Below Remembers. Aaron has listened to me tell excerpts of it to him. It is set in a world where the empires of the Indian subcontinent, kind of in the ancient world, was the major colonial power and took over much of the world because they had access to giant robot mech technology. And so now it is in the modern era, and a archaeologist discovers one of these giant mechs buried in the earth, and he's excited because this is uh, find of the millennium, basically. And the core conflict is that this archaeologist is hoping that this discovery will make him more famous than his boyfriend, because his boyfriend happens to be a superhero.
Oh my God.
So that is the
Amazing.
book. Um, I
I
will remember is my big game project that I'm working on is with the National Academy of Sciences. I'm working with them and my one of my old friends and co-designers, Yansu Kim. She is our head writer, and it is a tabletop role-playing game that we're trying to really innovate on mechanics on the form of what a tabletop role-playing game is. Like it's a little different, but we're also talking about themes of plant blindness and how societies engage and think about plants. So Jeeyon might be into that.
Ooh, I want to hear all about this later. You better tell me.
uh, that's a big thing, and of course, I'm doing a lot of small projects. With like, I'm working for a little project with Humblewood. I'm working on a couple of other things I can't say. Um, and I'm always working on short stories. Gotta keep doing that. I think those are my big projects right now.
Yeah,
so
you reminded me that I'm also writing two novels. I completely
Yeah,
forgot to say so.
Yeah. Yeah. Jeeyon and I are similar in that we're always doing a lot of different types of work at the same
Yeah,
time.
I can't exist otherwise. It's like my
Yeah.
brain, it's like a
I
shark.
also
I
see
have to keep moving.
sometimes I envy people who are like, I will focus
I
all my
know.
attention
No,
on one
I
project
super
and do it.
do.
I
Yeah,
And I'm
they
like,
seem to be peaceful people with peaceful lives, and I'm like, I want that. I'm
yeah.
never gonna have that, but I want that for me, you know?
Aaron has been hearing excerpts of my story on Tuesdays We Wear Starlight for like 3 years, and I still haven't finished it.
Just the entire time, you
What was that?
know?
What was that?
And it's been tremendous the entire time. I also appreciate that you're like, oh, right now I'm working on Redacted and, history. Uh, but yeah, no, again, I love all the projects you're working on. I am so thankful for your time. And as we close out, I just want to get to this amazing question from Zach, which is a great question for both of you to close out on, which is now that we've talked about all of these amazing things that we've done in games and that you've done just with your entire careers, which are phenomenal. What are some challenges you faced when incorporating diverse cultural perspectives into your game designs, and how have you navigated those challenges?
I have one that was wild. The Floodgate Games published this board game. The people who published Sagrada, for example, they published a board game called Holy Festival of Colors, and they're like, Sharang, you're Indian. We want you to be cultural editor for this, right? And I'm like,
Oh.
okay, I lived in India for 5 years of my life.
Yeah.
Um, I feel like a fraud. But their strategy was very good. They're a great company because they made sure to have multiple culture editors. So one of their culture editors
Mm,
was a Hindu priest. And so
Wow.
they're like,
that
Sharak, it's
rules.
fine. Right. They're like, we're getting him to be the culture editor from the like, is this religiously whatever side of things. And they literally said, your experience as an Indian person who has not lived in India for most of their life is valid and valuable. Because I was having a lot of like, I'm a fraud. Or should they even hire me? But they're like, no, your personal idiosyncratic experience is something that is useful and relevant and valid. And I was like, oh, okay, thank you. And so that was a thing about like imposter syndrome and being like, no, I mean, as long as I was, I think, upfront with it, I told them this. I'm like, I have not lived in India since I was 6 years old, 5 years old. I moved back and forth. So that was a interesting challenge that was like needed some pep talk for me to navigate.
Yeah.
And Jeeyon, what?
Um, my answer to this question, I think, is not as specific. I was once asked point blank why I don't write games about race and my racial and ethnic heritage. And I don't think the person meant to be, I don't know,
Me,
insensitive, but
yeah.
I answered honestly, which was it's too precious to me. And I know myself, and I'm a very patient person. Patience is like literally a work skill that I cultivated over many years of working with
Dealing with
children
kids, yeah.
and their parents, most importantly.
I'm sure it's more patience for the parents than the
Yes,
kids.
1000%. However, I know what my buttons are and I know what I have a short fuse about. And one of them is like my identity and my heritage, right? People saying ignorant things, people, it gets me very worked up very quickly and I don't make good choices for myself. And so when I write games, it's not like I'm deliberately leaving parts of myself out. Like you said earlier, all of our experiences, including being in a diaspora, including being like Korean,
Mhm.
including being a second gen Asian American, like all of these get incorporated in different ways. Some of them are very tangible and I can point them out, and some of them are just more inchoate, but they're there. Um, it's the Han. But the other thing is I do think that game designers of color run the risk of being pigeonholed as the race designer if you don't demonstrate an eclectic and broad variety of interest in your work. And so, navigating how have I navigated out of the challenges of sometimes feeling tokenized or asked to consult or write for something basically because of who I am, not because of what I make. um a lot of it just comes down to having to cultivate your own self-awareness and know where your lines are for your own integrity. There are certain things where I'm like, it's not my favorite, but like I really need $500 right now or whatever. But there are some things that I absolutely, uh I joked to a friend recently that like, sure, I will do anything for money, but some things require a lot of money, you know? And that's, it turns out that's actually not true. Also, there are some lines that I just won't cross for myself because it's about how I want to feel about myself at night, you know,
There was
lying
a
in
really
bed thinking over
funny
my life.
really funny thing I saw. It was on TikTok or something. I don't watch TikTok. I watch it on other media. But they're like, would you become a sex worker for like $1 million? And that your question, your point make me think of that. I'm like, I would become a sex worker for a lot less money than $1 million.
But absolutely shoot the moon. If they're offering 1 million, take the 1 million. Absolutely. But yeah, I think this is a question. It's a good question to think about before you start making games publicly. Absolutely, it's good to kind of have an idea of what those lines are for yourself, what you will or won't be willing to do, and also like your own vulnerabilities, right? Uh, I know that my temper around people saying ignorant things about my racial identity or heritage is like a vulnerability of mine. I don't want to open myself up to the risks of having that vulnerability, right? Yeah, just actively cultivating self-awareness in these holistic, multifaceted ways, I think is the way you navigate your way out of it.
No, I appreciate that. I mean, again, this has been phenomenal. I really appreciate you being vulnerable, showing up, being kinky, as always, Sharang. It's been fantastic. And, just a little bit of housekeeping as we go. Again, this is the first of our game series. I'm so thrilled to have had both of you on and look forward to doing so again.
We're thrilled to be the inaugural
Yes,
speaker.
this was so wonderful. I love this.
Yeah, I mean, you both were incredibly lovely. And again, Culture Mercado is an arts and culture organization. And what we look at is basically what it is that brings us together, our shared humanity, some of those shared cultural things that we have in common. And then we uplift and celebrate what it is that makes us unique and different. And what I love is that both of you bring so much unique perspective to the games that you design, which is why they've won awards. You both said luck. It has nothing to do with luck. You make amazing games. And I, again, am just so over the moon that we were able to share time together. And for everyone who is participating, thank you so much. We're going to send out a thank you email with the recording, and I'm definitely going to be including a whole bunch of links from things that we've talked about. And I'm going to force Sharang and Jeeyon to share the projects support them on because they deserve to be supported. And any final words from both of you?
Just thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for engaging and having us. I wish all my conversations about my work could be this lovely and thoughtful.
Yeah, as artists, like the gift of your attention
Yeah,
is a very precious gift because that's what
it
artists
really
do. They
is.
want they want attention, right? So
It's so true. We're all just kids playing show and tell, like that's what artist careers are.
you think we're super intellectual, or not us? No one thinks we're intellectual.
Yeah.
But you think artists are super intellectual? No, no, no. They're like, look at my work, mommy. You like my painting, you know?
I love that though. That's why it's pure.
Very true. Well, again, thank you so much. We're heading out, so have a good one. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everybody.